Only an airman would see the Western Front as it really was in the spring of 1915. At 600 feet, you could fly along the pockmarked front and twisted trenches, running straight, then twisting and turning this way and that, in an apparently haphazard and unnecessary curve. No man's land, much wider in places than you might have thought from the maps at headquarters.
No man's land was the area of land that was between both trenches on either side. That neutral territory was heavily fought over throughout the entire war. In many cases at night, where a lot of patrol action went on, soldiers would have to crawl out through no man's land to try to get into the enemy trenches, either for intelligence purposes or to capture a prisoner to get more information from them. The land itself was usually an open stretch of land between two huge belted areas of barbed wire that each army had in front of their own trenches. So it was hotly contested. Artillery played such a tremendous role that no man's land was a mess. Deep shell holes, lots of mud, hard to traverse, and to get a sizable army to come through when you're attacking.
By the spring of 1915, the front line system was made up of 3 parallel lines: the fire trench, the travel trench at 20 yards, then the support line, close enough to reinforce in case of a raid. All 3 lines were built in dogtooth shapes with bays 5 paces wide, separated by hiccups in the line, designed to minimize bomb blasts and prevent enfilade fire should the enemy raiding party get into the trench. The depth of the trenches was about 4 feet, with a built-up wall of sandbags as a parapet to allow men to stand upright. The power of the bullets they had to keep out is suggested by the official widths laid down for these parapets: 18 inches for loose-packed earth, 38 inches for oak, or 7 feet of turf. At the bottom of the trench ran a drainage tunnel leading to sumps and covered with lengths of wooden ladder called duckboards. Facing the enemy was a step, the fire step, which brought rifles tucked into the shoulder up to ground level. Ideally, wire or wooden plank reverting completed the structure by checking the constant tendency of the trench sides to collapse. But usually this attention to detail was found only on the German side of the line. The support line was rather more complex, since less risk allowed greater comfort. Kitchens, latrines, stores, and mortar positions were dug at the end of short lead-off trenches. Dugouts, above all, were the trademark of the support trenches. Often they were 15-foot shafts that led to caves about 5 paces square and 6 feet high. Shape would be kept with wooden beams and wire netting. One British officer commented that most were as well furnished as his rooms in Oxford. Just how safe they were was another matter. If the roof was an iron sheet and a foot of earth, the dugout was just shrapnel-proof. Only 8 feet of earth would deter a 6-inch shell. This reliance upon positional defense created quite unprecedented material demands. The French, for example, at the end of 1915, estimated that there were 20 miles of trench for each mile of the line. By August of the following year, the figure was thought to be half again as much. If this figure is accurate, it means that on the Allied side, on the entire Western Front, there were some 15,000 miles of trenches. An individual's service in the trench system was relatively brief. Of the 20,000 soldiers in a division, only 2,000 were at the front at any moment. The Black Watch once served 48 days in the line unrelieved, but they were the exception. Few men fought for long periods.
Different armies acted differently. Some would rotate their troops out after so many weeks or so in a line. Also, casualties had a resulting effect on that. If they were particularly hard hit, they would pull a unit out and let them rest and refit and re-equip before they let them back in. Unlike now, where it's more scrutinized at the time, they weren't really aware of the psychological damage that were incurring on a lot of these soldiers for spending way too much time in the front. You know, they called it shell shock back then.
The interesting point here is that attacks and offensives were rare. In fact, they formed a very small portion of the soldiers' active service. While in the trenches, troops on both sides only saw the enemy very infrequently. In trench service, soldiers rarely found themselves in the same place more than 3 or 4 times. A British soldier in France for more than a few months could expect to serve in 3, 4, and 5 different sectors. Even in the same sector, he would be continually moving from trenches to billets, back to new trenches, and then to fresh billets. This is one of the few respects in which German trench routine was much different from the British. German regiments tended to remain much longer in one place. One German unit, on Vimy Ridge, the Bavarian 73rd Hanoverian Fusilier Regiment, had been there almost from the beginning of the war. For French, British, and Germans, the move to the front was much the same. The new company would take up its assigned position after at least one night in billets, which they had reached by a route marched from another part of the sector. These in themselves were grueling experiences, the troops often covering 15 or 20 miles. Only 10 minutes rest was allowed every hour, and in summer the exertion often proved too much. The men would move up to the front line at night because of the threat of hostile artillery. Most of the journey would be through the communication trenches, each platoon being separated by intervals of 100 yards. Again, deference to the enemy artillery. There was no light, and each man could only stumble along after the person in front of him, often through inches of mud or water. He would be only conscious of the dead weight of his load, often weighing 85 pounds, and the braces biting into his shoulders, of his thirst and the sweat of his body, and the longing to lie down and sleep. When the halt finally came, men would doze where they stood.
No man's land was very scary at night, and it was very hard to traverse, like I said. So it was the area where gains were measured in yards. If they could make 100 yards or 200 yards and lose 10,000 guys, that was considered acceptable, which in our standards now is absolutely absurd. Artillery was the main killer of everything, that and a machine gun.
As worn out and burdened as they were, the troops would stumble into their new position, and the replaced unit would hurriedly assemble and make their own laborious way back down the communication trench and support trench. Company headquarters were set up in a dugout, and the men allocated their various duties. Like everything else, the daily routine in a forward trench varied from unit to unit. Certain features, however, were standard. The most important of these was that at all times some portion of the men would be on sentry duty. The task was usually split into 2 or 3 hour watches. At night, the number of sentries usually doubled, leaving less time to sleep. Sheer exhaustion, in fact, was one of the greatest problems at the front. After dark, sentries had orders to stand with their head and shoulders above the parapet. It required greater vigilance and also put the top of the guard's head above the level of the trench. Enemy machine guns were trained on this level, and it would be safer to get hit in the chest or shoulders than in the forehead. The whole 24-hour cycle in the trenches revolved around Stand 2, just before dawn and dusk, where everyone mounted the fire step in case the enemy should choose this propitious moment to attack. The rest of the 24 hours was divided into 2 to 4 watches, those on duty being told to be particularly vigilant at night. After the dawn stand to, there would normally be a tacit truce for an hour or so, as each side prepared and ate breakfast. After the morning meal, fatigue parties were assembled to repair the trenches, and other work was done. Lunch was at noon, followed by the dusk stand to for about an hour, after which fatigue parties worked all night.
It was horrible. The weather was awful. There was a lot of rain. The food was not very good in either armies. The water was tough because in many cases, particularly in the British, they would wash out petrol tins and fill it up with water, so the water usually tasted like gasoline. I talked to an American doughboy veteran many years ago who told me that one of the staples that they got was canned salmon. And he got canned salmon 3 meals a day for months on end, and he had never eaten salmon after the war ended for the rest of his life. They would have corned beef, which they called corn willy. They had roast beef, which they called monkey meat. The salmon was called goldfish. They also had stewed tomatoes, which one guy told me that he always carried 2 cans in his pack because he could drink the juice. He knew it was safe to drink, and he could always get a quick meal out of it.
Particularly wearing were the endless fatigues. The trenches nearly always required some sort of repair or modification. Rations and stores had to be carried up from the trenches farther back, or wounded men had to be carried back to the medical officer's dugout. And almost every day and night, men would have to advance into no man's land to repair a gap in the wire or lay even more. Fatigues were just as endless in the support and reserve positions. In between the heavy lifting, water bailing, trench digging, and wire laying, the soldiers, eye deep in hell, were expected to fight in a brutal conflict without end. In the latter half of the war, all sides began to realize that the soldiers simply could not sustain the dual role as combat troops and porters. The word fatigue was replaced by working parties. Somewhat later, the British and the Germans began to form labor battalions to do the heavy trench digging and road repairs, while the French used territorial regiments.
It really was hell on earth for these guys, and we have no conception of how tough these guys became in order to survive. They had to survive day by day, and rebuilding revetments, the trench lines that had been hit by shells, going out on patrols at night, stringing barbed wire, going out and cutting the other guy's barbed wire, removing wounded when they could get them. It was a constant battle between the elements and the enemy and nature, as far as the vermin that was there on a regular basis for them.
As soon as the trench lines were dug, it became apparent that the existing ways of waging war were inadequate. Trenches had no flanks, and the defender had an almost insurmountable advantage. Calculations suggested that in 1915, a rifle-armed trench garrison with a clear field of fire would need to be assaulted by a force 12 times the defenders' numbers to ensure that the attacker would have a chance to reach the enemy line with enough strength left to take the position and hold it. The immediate consequence was a mad scramble to procure weapons and revise tactics which could deal with trenches or force the enemy to throw their best troops into the meat grinder to avoid losing the war. German General Falkenhayn faced a challenging strategic problem at the end of 1915. Although he assumed Russia would be incapable of offensive action for the foreseeable future, Russia had not been knocked out of the war. Germany still needed to maintain significant forces in the east to protect against any Russian action in the east, however limited. Falkenhayn could count on only 26 divisions as a reserve in the west. Across the no man's land, he faced 2 enemies who each possessed large reserves, ensconced behind well-constructed trenches. The chief of the Imperial General Staff had to determine where and how to launch an attack with the limited resources available in 1916. Although Falkenhayn believed the British Expeditionary Force to be Germany's main enemy, Great Britain was the more difficult enemy to defeat. Falkenhayn felt that they occupied a defensive position with the highest concentration of troops anywhere on the Western Front, and this position could not be assailed with the forces at Germany's disposal. Furthermore, he believed that even if Germany were to deal the British forces a powerful blow, this would not force Britain from the war. Despite these difficulties, General Falkenhayn felt that Germany could, in 1916, convince Britain that it would never defeat Germany. In order to accomplish this, he planned to strike the British Isles sea lifeline by unleashing unrestricted submarine warfare. As he struck a hard blow to the British belly, he also planned to knock England's best sword out of her hand by delivering a crushing blow to France and destroying the French soldiers' will to fight. On the 3rd of December, Falkenhayn apprised the Kaiser of the state of the planning for operations in 1916. General Oberst Hans von Plessen recorded the meeting in his diary.
General von Falkenhayn rolled out for His Majesty a serious picture of the situation, with the conclusion that to carry the war to its end, an attack in the west, where all available strength has already been collected, should be attempted. It is to be then that the Entente will attack us in the west, and thereby bleed themselves white.
Although his ideas were not clearly defined in early December, Plesson's diary entry indicates that by this point, Falkenhayn had contrived the notion that the French must be forced to attack the German positions, thereby throwing successive waves of reinforcements into a German meat grinder. He intended to attack the French at the one location where they would be forced to respond immediately with a counterattack. That location was the fortress city of Verdun, a symbol of French national pride. In 1914, before the Battle of the Marne, Verdun had stood like a rock against repeated German assaults. If it had fallen, Paris, even the war, might have been lost. It was the hinge of the whole Allied line. At first glance, Verdun's defenses looked formidable. Almost completely encircled by ridges and hills on both banks of the Meuse River, Verdun was protected by a ring of forts, 20 large and 40 small ones. The strongest cornerstone of them all was Fort Douaumont, perched on a 1,200-foot height northeast of the city on the right bank. However, the strength of the forts was illusory. Many of the guns had been removed by the French general headquarters to provide extra firepower for the autumn offensives the previous year. By 1916, over 200 guns had been removed. On December 8th, Falkenhayn had a long discussion with Generals Tappan and Wild about an attack on the forts at Verdun. An attack on Verdun had several advantages. First, the area was well served by several rail lines and could be enhanced by the construction of several spur lines for transporting supplies and heavy rail artillery to frontline troops. Second, the fortress of Verdun sat at the center of a salient which could be dominated by the German guns. General Lieutenant Adolf Wild von Hohenborn recorded in his diary the advantage this would give.
During the attack from the north and the east, the French positions will soon be so diminished that not even a mouse can live in them. Most importantly, Verdun was an object for the retention of which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they have.
The offensive would be conducted by the German Fifth Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm, the heir to the throne, thus ensuring the Kaiser's support. The Crown Prince may have been in command of the army, but his chief of staff, General Smith von Nobelsdorf, was in tactical control. The first phase of the offensive was given the code named Gericht, meaning judgment. Falkenhayn's directive to the Fifth Army was to mount an offensive in the direction of Verdun. But there was no mention in this communiqué about capturing the city. But the Crown Prince Wilhelm had other ideas.
The objective is to capture the fortress of Verdun by precipitous methods.
It was this discrepancy in interpretation that was to cost Germany dearly. Several points were critical to the success of the plan. First, the Germans had to retain sufficient reserves to meet the expected relief offensive. Second, they had to keep sufficient forces to launch a counteroffensive once the French forces had worn themselves out in their relief offensive. And finally, Falkenhayn's plan for 1916 relied upon the enemy doing exactly what Falkenhayn wanted. 140,000 infantrymen were assembled to make the attack. Whole villages were evacuated to make room for them. The German commanders secretly massed over 1,230 artillery pieces behind the front. Siege guns, naval guns, quick-firing guns, field guns, and mine throwers. These were the guns that were to do the bleeding white. To supply this fearsome army, the Quartermaster General of the Imperial General Staff assembled 1,300 munitions trains. In an endless stream, they transported 2.5 million shells. With utmost secrecy, the buildup continued day and night. On the French side of the line, the alarm about the state of the defenses at Verdun had reached French General Headquarters at Chantilly. The French Minister of War, Joseph Gallieni, wrote to the French Commander-in-Chief.
Reports have come to me indicating that in the Verdun region, the line of trenches appears not to have been completed. Should the enemy break through, not only would your responsibility be involved, but also that of the entire government.
Joffre replied,
Nothing justifies the fears which you express in your dispatch.
As preparations continued, German planes patrolled the forward areas in strength, ready to pounce on any French reconnaissance plane that might venture across the lines. The Imperial Air Corps had complete air superiority. They had assembled the greatest concentration of air power ever employed in war so far. 168 planes at Verdun and a large number of observation balloons. Now, even Joffre became apprehensive.
Our minister to Denmark telegraphed that a German offensive was being talked about. This was immediately confirmed by news from Switzerland of the concentration of 400,000 men in the region of Verdun.
A regiment of engineers was immediately sent to Verdun to strengthen the defenses on the east bank. With every tick of the clock, time was running out for the poorly prepared and outmanned French. German troops continued to pour into their forward trenches, the starting point for the grand offensive. By the thousands they came, the best troops in the German army, veterans hardened by 2 years of trench warfare. 24 hours before D-Day, all was ready. The troops now only had to wait for Judgment Day. Germanic efficiency had accounted for every eventuality, everything but the weather. Gales, rain, and blizzards forced Falkenhayn to delay the assault scheduled to start on February 12th for 9 days. 9 days of trying to hide 1 million battle-ready men, the massed artillery, and mountains of ordnance from air reconnaissance, to hide from French patrols, and pray that talkative deserters did not give the plan away. 9 critical days for the French to bring in 2 more divisions of veterans, in hopes of stemming the German storm about to break on Verdun. The battle opened at dawn on February 21st. 21 miles behind the German lines, a single Krupp's 38-centimeter naval gun fired the first round at a bridge spanning the Meuse. This shell missed its target, but it was the signal for the massed German artillery to unleash an unprecedented 9-hour bombardment. 1 heavy battery for every yard of trench, 1,000 guns in all.
It is a war of brute material. For hours on end, you bombard them with 210s, 305s, and 380s. And when everything appears dead, when there's no more wire and no more trenches, and when the survivors have been reduced to a state of madness, they send the masses out to attack. When the French are on the receiving end, not one of them breaks through. And if there's only 10 out of 100 left, these 10 will fight on. Letter from a French soldier in the line, February 21st, 1916.
More than 80,000 shells fell in the Bois des Craux alone.
The Boches started to bombard us with large caliber shells for 10 hours. It was enough to drive you mad. We were buried alive, my entire squad, but miraculously, all 7 of us emerged without a scratch. But of the 5 unlucky ones who came and took refuge with us in our dugout, 2 were killed, and 3 were wounded. A soldier of the 311th Infantry Regiment, February 21st, 1916.
With their rearward communications severed, the bewildered defenders were in no condition to repel a major assault.
Here and there in the front line were a few men who by chance escaped. In all our minds we had the same thought, that everyone to right and left had been killed.
As he waited for orders to advance, a young Hessian scribbled a last note to his mother.
There's going to be a battle here, the likes of which the world has never seen.
The order came, over the top. The advance elements of the German army had, through a lunar landscape crisscrossed by barbed wire and dotted with concrete fortification, on they came.
They moved slowly, not in a straight line, as though they were picking their way. Nothing could have looked less like an assault. Some of the Germans had containers strapped to their backs. They seemed like laborers going to spray the vines.
These laborers were carrying flamethrowers. The Germans were trying out their new weapon on the French. The tons of oil propelled by compressed nitrogen turned men into flaming torches. Fortunately for the French, the German planners had been too cautious. They had given strict orders limiting infantry operations on the first day to strong fighting patrols, which would employ infiltration tactics to seek out weak spots in the French line. Only the 7th Reserve Corps commander, General Hans von Zweil, disregarded these orders and showed what might have been achieved. He deployed stormtroopers just behind the fighting patrols, and in 5 hours secured the Bois de Haumont. In the Bois des Caux, however, Émile Driant's shrewd use of strong points instead of continuous trench lines enabled the surviving chasseurs to defend that position obstinately against the German 28th Corps. On February 22nd, von Zweil was again spearheading the German assault, bursting through a regiment of territorials on the French 72nd Division's left at the Bois de Concevoir, and then seizing Haumont to tear open a gap in the French first line of trenches and expose the left flank of the Bois des Caux. During the late afternoon, the heroic Driant was killed while attempting to lead his shattered battalions to the safety of Fort Douaumont. In less than 2 hours, much of the French front line had crumbled. But the Germans were also suffering heavy losses, especially among the elite stormtroopers. Losses they could ill afford. The next day, the Germans came up against an intermediate line that had only recently been created, and so was not marked on any German map. The dogged defense of Herbevois by the French 51st Division was finally over by late that evening, but overall German advances were less than expected. Ominously for the Germans, powerful French artillery was massing on the left bank of the Meuse. These developments were scant comfort to the French. Before dawn the next day, Saint-Maginot was in German hands. The 51st and 72nd Divisions were so badly mauled that they were on the verge of total collapse. Fort Douaumont fell, and in less than 3 hours, the second French line of defense fell apart. The 3rd Zouaves committed piecemeal to the battle with no protection from the bitter cold, and the fury of the German guns melted away after being assaulted by the Brandbergers. For the first time on the Western Front since 1914, German commanders sensed a breakthrough. Few trenches faced them, not much barbed wire, open country ahead, and 10,000 French soldiers had given up the fight.
They give one the impression of complete breakdown and complain loudly of their senior commanders.
The Kaiser himself came up to the front to watch the kill. By nightfall on February 24th, only the forts and a few brave men barred the Germans' way. The pivotal point in the defense of Verdun, Fort Douaumont, was now uncovered. On February 25th, the men of the elite 24th Brandenburg Regiment entered a gap left by the retreating 3rd Zouaves. They had no orders to capture Fort Douaumont. The objective lay short of the fort, but their regimental motto was, "Do more than your duty." In small groups, they pushed beyond the stipulated objectives as far as Fort Douaumont. Emboldened by the curious inactivity of the fort, a few pioneers, under a sergeant named Kunze, pressed through the outer defenses to the dry moat. Still undetected, they climbed through a gun embrasure into one of the fort's galleries. Inside the fort, the garrison numbered less than 60 overaged and undertrained territorial reservists, commanded by a sergeant major. A handful of men were manning the guns. Though German 42-centimeter shells had not inflicted critical damage on the fort, The shock waves and fumes they produced had driven the majority of the defenders to shelter in the bowels of the concrete bastion.
It's an unending hell. I live in a casement at the bottom of the fort with the light on day and night. You can't go out for fear of shell fragments which fall daily into the trenches and onto the fort. In a word, it is solitude in all its horror. When will this veritable martyrdom end? Letter discovered on the body of an unknown French soldier.
Kunze was followed in by 3 other assault teams. Without a fight, the defenders of Fort Douaumont, the world's most powerful fortification, surrendered. The capture of such a prize at minimal cost sparked national rejoicing in Germany. The Crown Prince himself decorated the brave Brandenburgers. The attackers appeared to have cleared a route into Verdun, only 5 miles away. In Verdun itself, confusion reigned. Whispers were exchanged. The city is lost. The commander of the French Central Army Group, de Langle de Carry, advocated the immediate withdrawal of all remaining French forces to the heights to the east and southeast of the fortress city. However, the combative de Castelnau at French General Headquarters opposed this withdrawal. Having ensured that General Henri-Philippe Petain's Second Army would be brought out of reserve to hold the left bank of the Meuse, he also called for Petain's area of responsibility to embrace the right bank of the Meuse, which was to be defended at all cost. Petain, a peasant from northern France, was a colonel due for retirement at the start of the war. Now Petain was summoned to come forward as the savior of France. The soldiers had heard the stories told of Petain. They knew he cared for his troops and that he was frugal with men's lives.
By 1915 and 16, there's more of an equal exchange going on between the enlisted men and their officers. Officers continued to mainly be middle class. They were not, as in the British Army, more of an aristocratic class. That's actually not so true in the French Army. You also had a lot of NCOs being promoted up through the ranks because the casualty rate for officers was so high that they were just promoting from within. So by the end of the war, while you had certain disruptions in the French Army that became mutinous, that relationship changed even more radically. But there was always a firm structure in place. If anything, it started to mirror more what we would expect in a modern military force.
The diminutive general would have preferred to withdraw to a new defensive position. Petain understood modern firepower and was trusted by his troops. He told his commanders to conserve their strength for the counteroffensive to come. His very presence at Verdun lifted morale and inspired renewed confidence in the Verdun forts as the backbone of a line of resistance. French artillery was concentrated to give the Germans a taste of attrition. As one French artilleryman observed from the banks of the Meuse, at the top of the ravine on the edge of the plateau was a great heap of Germans. Not one was standing. The whole ravine was gray with corpses. One could not see the ground, they were so numerous, and the snow was no longer white. We calculated there were fully 10,000 dead at that point alone, and the river ran past dappled with patches and streaks of blood. Above all, Petain grasped the importance of logistics. All rail links to Verdun were cut by German long-range artillery. Only a single narrow-gauge rail line remained open. Alongside the railway ran one second-class road. It was only 20 feet wide, just wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. Petain took pains to ensure that supplies were maintained along this single viable route south, a road which a French writer named the Voie Sacrée, Sacred Way. The trucks that bumped along it on solid rubber tires were commandeered from all over France, over 3,000 of them. Their lines never ended. In the critical week of February 25th, thousands of tons of supplies and 190,000 men passed along it. 6,000 vehicles a day, one every 14 seconds, for hours and hours on end. By June, vehicles were moving up and down this lifeline at the rate of one every 14 seconds. In the months ahead, 2/3 of the French army were to pass along this road, destined for the meat grinder of Verdun. To some extent, these measures were playing into Falkenhayn's hands. Yet, as de Castelnau knew, French doctrine and national sentiment made it inconceivable for the French army to abandon Verdun. The German advance was, in truth, already losing impetus before Petain's measures began to take effect. Nearly 250,000 men were involved in the battle. The bloodletting was getting out of hand.
Our blinded, wounded, crawling and shouting soldiers kept falling on top of us and died while splashing us with their blood. It was a living hell.
Anyone who has not seen these fields of carnage will never be able to imagine it. When one arrives here, the shells are raining down everywhere with each step one takes. But in spite of this, it is necessary for everyone to go forward. One has to go out of one's way not to pass over a corpse lying at the bottom of the communication trench. Farther on, there are many wounded to tend, others who are carried back on stretchers to the rear. Some are screaming, others are pleading. One sees some who don't have legs, others without any heads, who have been left for several weeks on the ground.
Falkenhayn made few reserves available, and Fifth Army now rued its earlier caution in deferring the main infantry attack until the second day. As fire increased from French artillery on the left bank of the Meuse, particularly from guns near the Bois-Bourros ridge and a hill known as Les Morts-Hommes, the Dead Man, the Germans regretted confining their first attack to the right bank. Persuaded by the Crown Prince and von Knobelsdorff that this flanking fire must be suppressed, Falkenhayn provided more troops so that the offensive could be extended to the left bank. A major attack, centered on Les Morts-Hommes, was made on March 6th, followed quickly by a renewed push on the right bank towards Fort Douaumont. The Crown Prince, for one, wanted the battle to be terminated once German casualties exceeded French losses. The hellish pattern of the Verdun fighting for months to come was firmly established in March. All German attempts to seize Les Morts-Hommes failed, and each assault invariably prompted a French counterattack. By mid-March, the Kaiser was admitting privately that he could see no end to Verdun. General von Gallwitz was heard to quip that the town would finally be reached at the earliest in 1920. Yet the battle went on. Artillery fire from both sides was unrelenting. By the end of March, German casualties totaled 81,607, only 7,000 fewer than the French.
At Verdun, the ones who have suffered the most are the wounded, and, along with them, the stretcher bearers who transport them. Some of the bearers carry them from the front lines all the way to our post, 1.5 kilometers. Other ones take them in order to carry them off to Fleury, and having arrived there, the wounded have almost another 2 kilometers to go by stretcher before they can be transported by car. Imagine such a trip under the shells which hardly ever stop, through a landscape full of shell holes, tree trunks, and wrecked wire, through deep mud, and in certain areas, through clay, where the stretcher bearers sink down all the way to their waists, being forced to call for help to get themselves out of difficulty.
The Germans, too, realized that they needed to adjust their command structure at Verdun. General von Gallwitz was given responsibility for the left bank, and General von Mudra was entrusted with the right bank. Even with new commanders and fresh troops, April passed with Les Morts-Hommes and the neighboring heights, Côte 304, still beyond their clutches. Wavering between ruthlessness and self-doubt, Falkenhayn started to ponder the possible need to seek a decision elsewhere, and the Crown Prince harbored even greater reservations about prolonging the battle. Knobelsdorff had no such misgivings and convinced Falkenhayn to continue the attack. After a heavier bombardment than that of February 21st, the Germans took Hill 304 early in May and had seized the whole of Le Mont-Homme by the end of the month, but at a frightful cost.
You must know that we are at the environs of Verdun, near Hill 304 and Verdun. What carnage! It is horrible to see what we are seeing. We have been here now for 12 days, and every day we have serious losses. I consider myself lucky to have escaped up to now. Let's hope that it continues like this until we are relieved, which should be any day now. I hope so, because what you see every day is enough to break your heart. Moreover, we are not well because we have all caught dysentery. You can't eat, and I assure you that we're not very strong here. In short, we hope that we'll be lucky enough to make it back. With this heat, this stench, and all these unburied corpses and rotting flesh, we think that is what's making us ill.
The enemy was now reduced to tunneling and blasting the fills ceaselessly with artillery. Eyewitnesses noted how shells buried the dead, then disinterred them, then cut them into even smaller portions. According to one estimate, the German artillery expended anything up to 17 trainloads of shells in a single day. Petain's achievements in slowing the Germans were hardly extolled by Joffre, who wished to adopt a more offensive stance and was worried that the unending battle was soaking up reserves that would be required for the impending battle for the Somme. Joffre's solution was to elevate Pétain to the command of the Central Army Group and appoint Robert Nivelle as Pétain's successor at Second Army. Nivelle took direct control of the battle on May 1st. Along with Nivelle came Charles Mangin, a divisional commander nicknamed the Butcher, or Eater of Men, because of his belief in attacking regardless of losses. Rejecting Pétain's advice to wait until he had enough men to strike on a broader front, Mangin, with the approval of Joffre and Nivelle, hurled his 5th Division into a murderous yet vain attempt to recapture Fort Douaumont on May 22nd and 23rd. The battle now created its own momentum, resembling an all-consuming monster impossible to control. Attack-minded commanders on both sides ensured that there would be no pause in the slaughter. Disappointed at the negligible progress on the right bank, Noblesdorf won Falkenhayn's endorsement for a new 5-division assault in this sector. The attack, codenamed May Cup, commenced on June 1st with the objective of capturing Fort Vaux, Fort Seville, and the strongpoint called the Orage des Thiermonts, seen as the final obstacle shielding Verdun. The German experimental Sturmabteilung, or assault detachment, had been transferred to Fifth Army before the opening of the battle, and had been committed to the initial assaults in small groups, wherever resistance was expected to be stiffest. By April, the unit had been increased to a battalion. In its expanded form, the Sturmabteilung would field a complete machine gun company and a battery of mountain howitzers, in place of the 3.7-centimeter guns it previously used. In May, the High Command took the important decision that every army would send men to the Assault Battalion for training in the latest methods. These men would pass on their skills upon returning to their formations, so that new regimental and divisional assault units could be established throughout the German army. At Fort Vaux, the garrison fought valiantly, disputing every yard of the dark underground passages against grenades, gas, and flamethrower attacks.
We had no communication with Syria for 3 days and nights because the bombardment did not let up. We were not even able to get our rations, and we only ate biscuits and chocolate, and there was almost nothing to drink. Finally, we were able to get our rations, but with a lot of difficulty. Therefore, we're glad to get out of here, because we've been completely brutalized by the bombardment. One has to have a strong heart to endure such a martyrdom. This is not war. It's a massacre. Oh, when will it end? It's terrible to see what's happening.
Finally, after enduring 6 days of the unendurable and suffering from extreme thirst, the gallant garrison capitulated. The next day, the Germans took hold of the Orage de Douaumont, only to lose it later in the afternoon. Over the next 4 months, Orage de Douaumont would change hands 14 times. Pétain's line of resistance was cracking, and he was becoming ever more irritated by British inaction on the Somme offensive, combined with Nivelle's profligacy with troops in incessant counterattacks at Verdun. General Pétain remembered the sight of French troops moving forward for one more assault.
Their expressions seemed frozen by a vision of terror. Their gait and their postures betrayed a total dejection. They sank beneath the weight of horrifying memories. They had passed through a fiery ordeal, and neither they nor the Europe they had once known were ever the same after it.
By June 12th, the Second Army had just one fresh brigade in reserve. The Germans were hamstrung by their own manpower problems at the critical moment. Brusilov's offensive in the east against the Austrians on June 4th had forced Falkenhayn to release 3 divisions from the west for the Eastern Front. While the original aim of the Verdun offensive had long since been obscured, the cost in blood had been too high for either side to risk national dishonor by becoming the first to withdraw from the battle.
I stayed 10 days next to a man who was chopped in 2. There was no way to move him. He had one leg on the parapet and the rest of his body in the trench. It stank, and I had to chew tobacco the whole time in order to endure this torment.
The intransigent Noblesdorf ordered one more assault on Fort Seville on July 11th, and some 30 soldiers reached its glacis, within sight of Verdun, before they were pushed back, captured, or killed. This was the nearest the Germans came to Verdun. The opening of the Somme offensive on July 1st changed the whole strategic picture, and Falkenhayn directed the Fifth Army to adopt a defensive attitude. The Crown Prince's wishes were finally granted on August 23rd, when the Kaiser sanctioned Noblesdorf's transfer to the Eastern Front. Romania's entry into the war on the Allied side 4 days later precipitated the downfall of Falkenhayn, who guaranteed the Kaiser that this would not happen. The Kaiser had had enough. Falkenhayn was succeeded as Chief of the General Staff by Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who brought with him as his own Chief of Staff Ludendorff, the hero of Liege. The direction of the war on the Western Front was about to make a dramatic change. After visiting the Western Front in early September, Hindenburg and Ludendorff made crucial changes in German tactics and strategy. On September 2nd, strict defensive posture at Verdun was decreed. To the German soldiers facing the inevitable French counterstroke at Verdun, these changes were of little immediate help. The French struck on October 24th. Ouvrage de Douaumont and Fleury were rapidly retaken, as was Fort Douaumont, which fell to Moroccan troops. Fort Vaux was recaptured on November 2nd, and much of the ground lost between February and July. On December 15th, another attack carried the French lines 2 miles beyond Douaumont, but the Germans clung to Le Mort-Alme. This last convulsion brought the agony of Verdun to an end. French casualties tallied 377,000. German losses numbered 357,000. No one had secured any discernible advantage from the slaughter. Falkenhayn's failure to reconcile the means to the end had caused his original strategy to backfire. In the process, he drained the lifeblood from the German army as well as from the French.
The Germans were on the offensive early in the war, but by Verdun, in 1916, they knew they weren't going to be able to win it offensively. So the Germans fell back to better terrain, shortened their lines, which allowed them to have more divisions available. Now, they go on the defensive. The French and the English now have to kick the Germans out of the French and Belgian territory. That forces them to be on the defensive.
Neither side would completely recover from the battle before the armistice.
in water, up the horizon such, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Home falls right, son, how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, won't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pay. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead. But we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. What? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Come for us, retard, we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.